when you were 16, 17, 18, early 20s, did you know you wanted to be an author?
I wanted to be a comic book writer and illustrator. Mostly illustration. I wanted to draw, and that's what I did through high school and into college. But eventually, as I kept doing it, I found that the writing part of it was more satisfying to me than the drawing part. I like the storytelling, and writing to me seems to be a more efficient way for me to tell the stories I want to tell. So that's kind of when I got really serious about it, is when I backed away from the comic book thing when I was maybe 22 or 3 and started going to the writing.
I think as I read one of your biographies, it did indicate that you may have been at the Minneapolis College of Design for at least a couple of semesters.
Yeah, I was at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design for 2 years, and then I transferred over to the U and went there for about another 5 years. Never graduated. Took every one-level class I could and virtually no higher-level classes. As a consequence, I know a little bit about almost everything and a great deal about absolutely nothing, which is good training for a writer.
As you write a book, do you have to do a lot of research?
Oh, I love research. It's easier than writing. Yeah, and it's nice I can... one thing that's changed, and I think in some ways for the good, in some ways not so good, is used to be research involved letter writing, travel, meeting with people, telephone calls, libraries. Now it's 90% internet, because there's just so much information that you can get there, and it's so much easier to correspond by email. And it's made the whole thing a lot more efficient, but it's also taken away some of the serendipitous stuff. Like there's nothing quite like going to a library to find out about, say, blood diseases, which I did for one of my books, and then turning the page and finding yourself reading about something completely different, like blood fluke infections in southern and central Africa. And you don't know, you never know when you're going to need to know this stuff, especially if you're a writer. So a lot of that like accidental information that used to come in from spending hours in the library and from just having casual conversations with people, like my conversation with the water tower guy, led to a whole nother book. If that had been strictly an email thing, I don't think that would have happened.
Or you indicated that one of your books just flew, it must have flown onto your computer screen in like 5 weeks.
Yes.
But then some of your books take 2 years to complete. How do you... It's got to be a lot of work, and people don't understand that.
Yeah. Well, I probably on average write about a book a year, but I work on 5, 6, 7 books at a time. Sweet Blood took 25 years, from when I started it to when it was published. Invisible took 5 weeks. Most often it's 3 to 5 years between the time I have an idea for a book and when I finally finish a draft of the book. I'll work on something for a couple months, set it aside. For example, I'm working on a science fiction trilogy right now, and I'm just finishing up probably the 14th draft of the first volume of 3. And that I started in 2003. So that's been about 7 years to get the first book in the trilogy done. And the next books 2 and 3 are due next year and the year after, so they had better go faster.
As you spent the day here today in Willmar, what was your impression of the students who talked to you?
Pretty smart, pretty active, a little raw. A lot of the students here, including some of those that asked a lot of questions, I just felt there was a tremendous amount of energy there, that they were, in fact, I was amazed at how still the group as a whole was. But mostly I was impressed by the intelligence of the questions and the fact that kids that ask them really listen to the answers for the most part. So if a typical, like a middle school, high school experience is a kid asks a question and 80% of the questions, they're not really listening to the answer. They just want to have asked a question. I don't know, maybe they get points for it, or maybe they get attention for it, or whatever. But this group seemed to be really involved in the process. I was really impressed, to tell you the truth.
Do you get to do this quite a bit?
I do between 10 and 15 visits to schools a year. I visit as young as 7th grade and up to 11th and 12th grade, probably mostly 8th and 9th grade. Where the reading level is for students varies tremendously between urban and suburban and rural areas, north and south. But I like it. It's really important to have contact with the people that I'm writing for, because I can write books and I can read reviews by librarians and teachers and educators and book professionals, and they're pretty good, and they have a pretty good idea of what younger readers are looking for, and they have a pretty good idea of what they're looking for. But really, a young reader is coming from a very, very different place than a 40-year-old librarian. For instance, Godless is probably by far the favorite book of most English teachers and librarians that I talk to. And I'm very proud of it. I think it's a good book. It's not the one that's usually named by younger readers, though. They would name Invisible or Sweet Blood or Rash as their favorite. So it's important for me to know that, because if all I did is looked at reviews and sales and stuff, I would be clueless.
Pete, you want to tell us a little bit about your Aboriginal background? Or?
Now, I was raised in a small tribe of 7 Aboriginal children in the Twin Cities area, in the suburb of St. Louis Park, where Godless is set. I'm the oldest kid in the family, and it was a totally chaotic household. And one thing I learned early on is that there were 2 things we could do that would not get us yelled at and that would very often enable us to avoid doing chores. One was reading, because a kid with his nose stuck in a book is not getting in trouble and is not in mom's way. And the other one was doing artwork. As my mom was a painter, we always had paints and crayons and drawing utensils, and my grandfather would bring us these big rolls of labels. He worked for a label company, and we would roll these rolls of paper out with the white side up and draw. And I don't know how many, hundreds or thousands of yards of these old misprinted labels we went through. But we were doing artwork. That was good, Now, if we were wandering around the house whining, well, then we'd have a job to do before we knew what was going on.